The empire was hollow. The brother was a parasite. And the boy was a ghost. To see how Kayleen Johnson returned from the dead, watch Part 1. This is Part 2, The Price of Revenge. Scene 1, The Will Hearing. The meeting room was a masterpiece of Arthur Johnson's design, a deliberate study in grays and blacks. It was a space built for gravity, yet it felt strangely ethereal. Floor-to-ceiling windows spanned the length of the far wall, fitted with glass that breathed with the sun. It controlled the passing of light so precisely that the interior always looked brilliant, yet the rays never felt harsh. In the corners, various tropical plants reached toward the ceiling, their broad, waxy leaves bringing a necessary softness to a room made of stone and glass. At the obsidian conference table, the air was thick with the scent of expensive ink and old secrets. A worried couple sat on the left, their shoulders hunched as if bracing for a physical blow. Their hands were joined under the table, a silent, desperate anchor in a room that was drifting away from them. Opposite them, a man with a smug face leaned back in his leather chair. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His expression was that of a predator watching the final grains of sand fall through an hourglass. To him, this was a coronation. From the head of the table, a pair of eyes watched the scene with a terrifying, unnerving stillness. The young man they belonged to, the heir to the hollowed-out empire, looked exactly as he should, a boy drowning in a suit too big for his grief. But behind that youthful mask, the gaze was too heavy, too analytical. He watched the smug man's pulse thrumming in his neck. He watched the way the light caught the moisture in the woman's eyes. In this moment, the room expected the boy to fold. The smug man expected a signature. The worried couple expected a betrayal. The silence stretched until it became a physical weight. The man of the couple finally broke it, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, just remember what your father built this for. It wasn't for the money. It was for the legacy." The young man at the head of the table didn't blink. He didn't look like a boy about to make a mistake. He looked like a man who had already seen how this story ended, and was currently deciding where to cut the thread. The man with the smug face leaned forward, his shadow cutting across the obsidian table like a blade. A smile decorated his features, the smile of a general who knew he had already won the war. "The Aegis 7 Defense Initiative," he said, sliding a thick leather-bound folder toward the center of the table. "This contract is our gateway into the national defense sector. It is a monumental addition to our conglomerate, a crown jewel that will solidify the Johnson name for decades." Behind his still, analytical gaze, Kayleen felt a phantom chill. He remembered this folder. In that other life, he had viewed this contract as a lifeline. He hadn't realized that the Aegis 7 project was never meant to succeed. Marcus had used it as a surgical incision into the company's heart. He had over-leveraged every stable branch of the Johnson empire to fund this defense project, only to funnel the capital into black hole shell companies. It had been a gaping wound, a massive siphon that bled the other businesses dry while Marcus stood by, pretending to mourn the unforeseen market shifts. "It's a bold move," Marcus continued, his voice dropping into that familiar manipulative purr. "Your father was always too cautious for the defense sector. But you have the vision. You just need to sign here, and we can begin the transition." The worried couple across the table looked at each other, their faces pale. Kayleen looked down at the pen resting on the table. He could feel the eyes of the predator on him, hungry and impatient. Kayleen looked up, his eyes wide and shimmering with a carefully manufactured look of hero worship. He looked at Marcus as if the man were a savior, a lighthouse in the storm. Marcus's smile broadened, his teeth gleaming in the soft, filtered light. With a slow, deliberate movement, Kayleen reached for the heavy fountain pen. He hovered the nib over the signature line, the tip almost touching the paper. Then, the performance began. His hand started to tremble. At first, a subtle vibration, then a violent, uncontrollable shudder. The pen clattered against the obsidian table, leaving a jagged black ink stain like a fresh wound. Kayleen's breathing became shallow and hitched, his face turning a ghostly, sickly pale. I can't, Kayleen whispered, his voice cracking with a feigned, fragile desperation. He clutched his temples, leaning back as if the very air in the room had turned to lead. The worried couple surged forward instantly. The aunt was at his side in a heartbeat. Her hand pressed firmly against his forehead. "He's burning up," she cried. "Marcus, look at him. He is in no state to be making these decisions. He's barely been awake. He still hasn't recovered from the coma. His brain needs rest, not this." Marcus's smile faltered. He was so close. He reached out, his voice a strained mask of concern. "It's just a dizzy spell, Kayleen. Sign the paper, son, and you can sleep for a week." But Kayleen was already slipping into the role of the invalid. He allowed his aunt and uncle to hoist him up, his body limp and uncoordinated. In the flurry of movement, the scraping of chairs and the aunt's frantic fussing, Kayleen's arm clumsily swept across the desk. He leaned heavily into the folder, his fingers snagging the leather edge and tucking it under his arm as he was led away, appearing to the world like a drowning man clutching at a piece of driftwood. "He's going home," the aunt declared. The heavy soundproof doors clicked shut, leaving Marcus alone in the velvet silence of the boardroom. He looked down at the obsidian table. His eyes narrowed as he realized the spot was empty. He let out a short, scoffing laugh. The boy took it. Marcus shook his head in amusement. In the rush of the moment, the brat had probably clung to the nearest object to keep himself upright. To Marcus, it was even better than a signature. It was proof that the Johnson heir was so broken he couldn't even distinguish a high-stakes contract from a security blanket. Scene 2. The Fortress and the Reminisce. The elevator ride was a masterpiece of sustained deception. Kayleen remained slumped against his aunt's shoulder, his breathing shallow, his eyes unfocused. He knew the building was a sieve. Marcus had eyes in the security cameras and shadows in every hallway. It wasn't until they crossed the threshold of the family estate that the air finally changed. This home was the only place Marcus's reach couldn't penetrate. Uncle Julian had spent the years turning the grounds into a digital and physical fortress, a sanctuary of encryption and steel. And if Julian was the architect of the walls, Aunt Elena was the dragon who guarded the gates. Finally, the heavy oak doors to his bedroom clicked shut. The doctors moved efficiently, but for the first time in 2 weeks, Kayleen stopped performing. He lay back against the pillows, clutching the Aegis 7 folder to his chest. As the house settled into a guarded silence, Kayleen closed his eyes, and the present faded away. His mind drifted back to the moment the darkness of the coma hadn't just ended, it had shattered. He had been in a coma for only 2 weeks, a sudden, violent vacuum of consciousness. But for Kayleen, those 14 days had been an eternity. The rebirth had struck like lightning on the morning of his birthday. He hadn't woken up as the 18-year-old boy. He had woken up with the searing, agonizing memories of a 34-year-old man. The transition was a sensory assault. One moment, he was a broken man hearing the sickening metallic screech and the ghostly echo of Lynn's final, "disappointed. Bye." The next, he was staring at a hospital ceiling, his body small, weak, and uncoordinated. The doctors had called it miraculous. Julian and Elena had wept with a joy so profound it was painful to watch. They didn't know. They couldn't know. Kayleen hadn't just woken up. He had been reincarnated into his own past. He possessed a ledger of blood written in a future that hadn't happened yet. He remembered the decade he had spent spitting on the names of the very aunt and uncle who were currently standing guard outside his door. Now, in the dim light of his bedroom, Kayleen's fingers tightened on the stolen defense contract. He wasn't the boy who fell into a coma 14 days ago. He was a man who had already lost everything once. And he had returned from the grave with one singular purpose: to ensure that this time, Marcus Vane would be the one who didn't survive the fire. Scene 3. The Midnight Audit. Miles away, in the silent sanctuary of the Johnson estate, the sick boy was very much awake. The Aegis 7 Defense Initiative was spread across his bed covers, illuminated by a single, shielded lamp. To Kayleen, the dooming details were glaring: the cross-collateralization clause, the intellectual property vacuum, and the indemnity trap. Kayleen reached out into the dark web of high-end corporate law. Operating as the Ant, an anonymous client with an unlimited crypto budget, he hired elite lawyers in Zurich and Singapore to redraft the contract. "Redraft the liability sections," Kayleen commanded through a voice scrambler. "Create a dead man's switch in the collateral clause if the funds are diverted to any account not pre-approved by the restricted trust. The entire contract voids, and the diverted funds are automatically reported to federal auditors as embezzlement." 3 days later, Kayleen returned to the Johnson headquarters. He looked paler than before, leaning heavily on Elena's arm. Marcus was practically pushing the Aegis 7 folder across the desk. "Just sign, Kayleen, and this weight is off your shoulders." But Kayleen had prepared a distraction. Strategic leaks triggered by the Ant caused a simulated federal raid on Marcus's offshore accounts. In the chaos of Marcus screaming into phones, Kayleen's arm, shielded by Elena's wide coat, swapped the folders. "I trust you, Uncle Marcus," Kayleen whispered, his hand trembling as he picked up the pen. With a shaky, illegible scrawl, Kayleen signed. As the ink dried, the Ant's trap was officially live. Marcus thought he had secured an escape hatch. He had actually signed his own death warrant. Scene 4. The Golden Grain Bakery. While Marcus fought ghosts in the corporate machine, Kayleen stepped out into the real world. He headed for the docks, the salt-stained industrial edge of the city where he and Lynn had first met in that other life. But the air remained cold. He realized with a crushing guilt that he was truly lost, until the Ants investigators delivered a dossier. Instead of a gutter-dwelling outcast, the photos showed a sun-drenched storefront, the Golden Grain Bakery. In this timeline, something had shifted. Lynn wasn't an outcast. He was standing behind a flour-dusted counter, laughing with a man who looked like the hard-handed father Lynn had once described. They were partners. They were happy. Kayleen stepped out of the car and pushed open the door. The brass bell chimed. Lynn looked up from a tray of cooling croissants. There was a sudden, subtle widening of his eyes, a momentary freeze. Does he remember the pier? Does he remember me? Kayleen froze. I used to know someone who looked like you. He tried, his hand gripping the edge of the wooden counter until his knuckles turned white. Small world, Lynn laughed, the sound clinical and efficient. He treated Kayleen with the practiced kindness he would show any stranger. Lynn turned his back to attend to a tray. As Kayleen walked back to his car, the croissant felt like a lead weight in his hand. He sat in the driver's seat, staring at the glowing yellow sign. His breath hitched, and then he let out a long, shaky exhale. A strange, twisted sense of relief began to wash over him. He doesn't know me, Kayleen thought. He hasn't been reborn. To Kayleen, the logic was simple. The Lynn who loved him to the end of the world was incapable of this level of indifference. He's just a boy who grew up loved by his father, Kayleen whispered. He's the version of Lynn that never met the monster I used to be. It was a comforting lie. It allowed Kayleen to believe Lynn was a clean slate. Proper this time, Kayleen could win him all over again. Scene 5. The Stoic Failure and the Rose Advice. For the next week, Kayleen approached the search for Lynn's heart like a merger. He arrived at the bakery at the same time every afternoon, draped in expensive wool coats, waiting for Lynn to be dazzled. It failed spectacularly. It seems that to the new Lynn, Kayleen looked like a wealthy college student who had spent too much time reading brooding poetry. That evening at the Johnson estate, Kayleen sat picking at his food. I'm trying to get someone's attention, a baker, but my usual approach isn't working. Elena and Julian exchanged a look of pure joy. Stoic doesn't work with people who spend their days in front of an oven, Elena purred. They want warmth, not marble statues. Julian let out a laugh. Son, you don't acquire a heart. You lure it. If you want a gardener to look at you, you have to be the flower, not the gardener. Come at him like the scent of blooming rose. Elena leaned in with a conspiratorial whisper. I'll set up an appointment with Dr. Aris. We'll discuss preparations, protective measures, the safe and comfortable way to navigate these new roles. Kayleen's face didn't just turn red. It turned a deep, perpetual shade of sunset crimson. Aunt Elena, I haven't even gotten him to tell me his favorite color yet. Scene 6. The Sentinel's Agony. Armed with Julian's advice, Kayleen traded his suits for a soft, oversized cream sweater. He became a fixture at the bakery, claiming a small, wobbly table in the far corner. To everyone else, he was a student. To himself, he was a silent observer. But Lynn remained a fortress of commercial enthusiasm. Refill on the black coffee? Kayleen? Lynn would ask. His voice bright, but his eyes already scanning the door. The perpetual blush Kayleen had been sporting vanished instantly on a sluggish, rainy evening. The door chimed. Lynn's reaction wasn't professional. It was visceral. His entire face transformed, a radiant, genuine light. You're late, Lynn teased, his voice dropping to a low, intimate vibrato. John walked in, shaking a wet umbrella. He didn't look like a titan. He looked like someone who knew exactly how Lynn liked his coffee. He reached out to familiarly pinch Lynn's cheek. He leaned in, and Lynn met him halfway. It was a quick, practiced kiss, the kind of casual intimacy that only comes from years of shared mornings and whispered nights. Kayleen's breath hitched in his ledger of blood. He had accounted for Marcus's greed and the lawyer's betrayals, but he had never accounted for this. For the next 2 hours, Kayleen was a prisoner in his corner, forced to watch the domestic symphony of Lynn's new life. He watched John help Lynn move heavy flour sacks. He watched them share a piece of a cinnamon roll. Lynn wiping icing from John's lip with a tenderness that felt like a physical blow. Every time Lynn looked toward the corner table, his gaze would skip over Kayleen as if he were just another piece of furniture. Kayleen realized then that his soft approach was failing for a reason he hadn't considered. The seat was already filled. He stayed until the closed sign was flipped. From his car, he watched John walk Lynn to the back door, their silhouettes merging under the street lamp. Kayleen gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He had come back to save Lynn from the dark, but as he watched them walk away, Kayleen had to face a devastating question. What if the dark in Lynn's life was always him? Thank you for joining me on this 3-part journey. Bringing Kayleen and Lynn's story to life through this cinematic lens has been an incredible experience. If you're enjoying the aesthetic and the high-stakes drama, please subscribe and stay tuned for the final chapter.